Today, we are going to talk about the ethics of organ acquisition. There's two primary readings that you have for this week. The first is titled The Case for Allowing Kidney Sales, and the second is titled The Case Against Compensating for Transplant Organs. So clearly, the first reading is going to be in favor of organ acquisition or the sales of organs, such as human kidneys. And the second is going to take an opposing position to the sale of human organs. So these two readings are kind of a nice selection because while they're not necessarily speaking with one another in these particular readings, they are engaging with the two different sides of the debate, two general sides of the debate. So we're going to go through the different arguments that are offered for each side. And then after that, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the assignment for this week. And that's because your assignment for this week is a little bit different than what you've done in the past. And I'll get to that at the end of the lecture here. But the first thing that I want to do is I want to introduce what's called the survival lottery. This was a kind of a thought experiment proposed by a philosopher named John Harris, who's arguing from a strictly utilitarian position. Now, I want to begin with this thought experiment. It's not in any of your readings, but I think it's a nice way to sort of set the stage for the larger debate that we're going to engage with. So let's go ahead and consider John Harris's thought experiment called the survival lottery. And again, John Harris is arguing from a very strict utilitarian position. And according to Harris, well, the belief that there is a morally relevant distinction or difference between killing and letting die, if we give up that belief, if we give up that distinction, and there might be some reasons that we're not going to get into at this point for why we might go ahead and give up that distinction. But if we do, then this will have consequences for what we have to say about the morality of being compensated for the acquisition of human organs. The basic idea is that if there is no morally relevant distinction between killing and letting die, then it might seem plausible, morally speaking, to kill someone in order to take their organs. But we're not going to do this in any kind of haphazard way. The thought experiment involves a lottery, so there's supposed to be some fairness involved. Now, Harris thinks that there's a premise that we should all intuitively accept. Intuitively, it seems as though it would be better, all things being equal, if those who are waiting for an organ would receive one rather than not and die. So we have to keep in mind that there's just a lot of harm that's brought about insofar as people die waiting for an organ. It's just a fact of the matter. It's just an empirical fact. There's too many people in need and not enough organs given our current altruistic sort of system that we have in place with regard to organ transplantation. And so Harris just thinks, well, yeah, it would be a better world because there would be less suffering in the world if those who needed organs got one. That seems intuitively like a premise, according to Harris at least, that we should all just accept. But notice that if it is true that there is a morally relevant distinction between killing and letting die, well, then to kill someone like Smith so that Jones and Jackson can live, well, that would just be ruled out because we have a strict obligation not to kill, but a duty of some form, some lesser kind of a duty to make sure that we can rescue those who need rescuing. But if that distinction is not accepted, if there is no morally relevant distinction between killing and letting die, then maybe, at least in some situations, it would be morally acceptable to kill Smith so that Jones and Jackson could live. And that might be argued for on utilitarian grounds. It would be better for two people to live and one die than for one person to live and two people to die. This is the kind of classic trolley car problem, right? So now let's think about the thought experiment itself. So suppose that A, just some random person A, is an innocent and healthy person. And suppose that B and C, again, two just generic people, B and C are both innocent but unhealthy persons. Now, why should A's lucky position in life, A is healthy, and B and C's unlucky position in life, B and C are both unhealthy, they need some organ transplant, why should that be a morally significant factor in who gets to live and who gets to die? Why should we think that the mere fact that B and C, for no reason of their own making, happen to be unhealthy and are about to die if they don't get these organ transplants, why should that matter in who should live and who should die? This is kind of the way in which Harris is setting up this thought experiment. And again, we can consider the trolley car problem, right? The 5 people on the track and the 1 person on the track, this is supposed to be just mere luck. The 5 are on one track and the 1 is on the other track. It's nothing that they did that brought themselves to that position in life. So why should the luck involved here make any moral difference with regard to who should live and who should die? What reasons could we give to rule out something like a lottery? So what exactly is the lottery then? So what Harris does is he proposes kind of a lottery that will determine who gets to live and who gets to die. This is why it's a thought experiment. Clearly, we don't have anything of this form. But what if we did? What reasons could we give to rule out something like a lottery, right? Given that maybe your intuitions in the trolley car problem is that you should kill the 1 in order to save the 5. Well, if we could use a mechanism such as a lottery in order to kind of take that decision out of our own hands, what reasons would we have to reject that kind of view, especially if your intuitions with regard to the trolley car problem is that you would kill the 1 in order to save the 5? So that's what we're going to have to think about. Harris proposes this lottery that's supposed to be run by a central computer, right? Some central computer that is able to make these decisions without any sort of human error or human biases that are involved. Maybe you don't think that that is a very good system, but nonetheless, Harris thinks that it's at least in principle possible for us to create a kind of central computer that would determine whose lottery number is drawn. So if that's the case, then everyone will be entered into the Oregon lottery, assuming that you're healthy and that there aren't any other reasons for you not to be entered into the lottery. And again, these sort of decisions will be taken out of our hands and they'll be put into the hands, so to speak, of the central computer. So if everyone is entered into this Oregon lottery, then given the very large number of people who are in this lottery, then it seems very unlikely that your number will ever be drawn. Yet it would be, presumably, very likely that should you ever need an organ transplant, then an organ will be available for you, right? So we have a lottery. If your number is drawn, then you will be killed and your organs will go to those who need it. But since there's just so many people in the lottery itself, then it's just very unlikely that your number ever will be drawn. Now, of course, people will probably be sort of suspicious of this, right? Seems there might be lots of reasons that we might want to object to this sort of thought experiment. The main objection you might think is, well, no, it seems scary. I would presumably live my entire life in fear of my number being drawn because even though I technically might know, the mathematics might tell me that it's very unlikely for my number to be drawn. Nonetheless, I might sort of be scared my whole life and living in fear of it being drawn. But Harris doesn't really think that that sort of an argument really works because it's far more likely, for example, that we might be hit by a car while walking across the street than our number being drawn. Do we intuitively walk around all day in fear of being hit by cars? Or lots of other sort of examples that we might think of where we just simply don't live in fear of these terrible things happening, but it's just far more likely that those terrible things might happen than our number being drawn. So Harris ultimately doesn't think that that kind of an objection works. And in the paper where Harris proposes the survival lottery, he actually goes through a number of different objections that we're not going to cover here. And so Harris just doesn't think that that's going to be a very good kind of objection to this thought experiment involving the survival lottery. And so what we can say then is that if A's number is called, then A will be killed, presumably honorably, in order to provide the organs for B and C, or whoever else might need them. And again, this is supposed to be right in line with the intuitions we have regarding the trolley car problem. And you can see how this is really being driven by Harris's very strict form of utilitarianism. So one might think that each of the following reasons actually could be given in support of this sort of thought experiment. We might appeal to beneficence and non-maleficence, right? Of course, the beneficence and non-maleficence here would be focused on B and C, the people who are waiting for an organ transplant, right? We might also appeal to utilitarianism. This is exactly what John Harris does. He just thinks that it would be a better world if less people were suffering, so we kill A in order to give the organs to B. via this kind of lottery that's being run by a central computer, of course. Presumably, we could even think of Rawls's theory of justice as involving something like this survival lottery. If we all agreed to that, then why would that not be a fair kind of way of allocating organs? And of course, the consequentialist intuitions that are involved in the trolley car problem clearly seem to be involved in how somebody might go about arguing for or in support of this kind of thought experiment. And so these are things that I want you to keep in mind. This is the main reason why I brought up this thought experiment of Harris's survival lottery, because although the readings that we're going to discuss next do not involve this lottery, they don't involve killing A and taking A's organs in order to give them to B and C. But we have a different, though similar, kind of question. What if A decided to sell her organs in order for B and C to live? What if A's autonomous choice was that she wanted to, instead of being altruistic and, donating her kidney, let's say, well, what if A was paid for, compensated for her kidney? What reasons could we give to show that that's not morally permissible? Well, right? What justification might we have to put a ban on the selling of organs? That's going to be our main issue, our main topic that we get into. But I wanted you to start by thinking about the survival lottery in terms of this kind of utilitarian ethic, insofar as it just is the case that people suffer and die waiting for organs. And so it seems plausible that if we could make more organs available to those people, then less suffering would happen. And presumably it would be a better place, all things being equal. Even if it's true that we have a lot of good reasons to justify this sort of survival lottery, nonetheless, it also seems true that most people will probably, for one reason or another, they will probably reject Harris's arguments. And so what we're going to do is, instead of focusing on the survival lottery, we're going to consider other approaches that one might take. We're going to consider arguments in support of the proposition that we should legalize the selling of human organs. And we're going to consider the sort of arguments against that proposition, right? So the basic idea here is, instead of killing A in order to give A's organs to B and C so that B and C could live, what if we compensated A, monetarily speaking, for giving her organs to B and C? Right? So the basic idea here is, instead of killing A, what if A made an autonomous choice? A decided for herself that she wanted to help B and C, and she was compensated. She was given money for it, right? So A sells her organ instead of having her number drawn and being killed. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to consider the different arguments that might be offered on both sides of this question about the legalization of selling of human organs, right? What reasons or what justifications might someone have to ban the selling of human organs? And what reasons, what justifications might somebody offer for why there should not be a ban or a prohibition against selling organs? That's going to be the primary thing that we're interested in going forward. But I did want to bring up the survival lottery because I think it's important to notice what our intuitions are here, especially as it relates to something like the trolley car problem. Because it just does seem true. It would be a better world if those people who are waiting to receive an organ were able to receive one, right? If they, instead of suffering and dying, waiting to receive an organ, if we could save their lives, if we could rescue them. Intuitively speaking, one would probably agree that that would be a better world where there's less suffering. And so that's the reason why we're starting with this thought experiment that Harris proposes involving the survival lottery. But now we're going to move on to consider the selling of human organs. And after you've done the readings and you've watched these video lectures, we're going to do something a little bit different with regard to the reading responses and the video conference this week. So again, stay tuned for that information. I'll talk about that at the end of this series of lectures. But what we're going to do next is we're just going to jump right into the position that says we should allow for the selling of human organs, such as the human kidney. And so that's what we're going to do next.